Hi everyone, I'm Jen, I'm an author and a book reviewer, and I'm here today to wrap up my 2023 year in reading. There are a few things that I want to do in this video. I would like to very quickly wrap up the books I read in November and December, because I didn't do monthly wrap-ups for those months because I wasn't reading a huge amount for me, but also I was doing quite a lot of reading vlogs, so I was talking about books anyway, plus I had just so many other things that I wanted to film festive-wise, so didn't get round to it. So we're going to do that. We're going to wrap up the books I read in November and December. Then I want to talk to you about yearly stats, because I don't know about you, but I just really love looking at the numbers. I didn't set myself any reading goals for this year when it came to stats, but I do track my reading in a spreadsheet that I've created, as well as using Storygraph. And I don't check in with that much throughout the year because I don't want to change the way that I'm reading by looking at the stats. It's just something I like to reflect on I think I've done it every quarter maybe, but specifically obviously looking at it at the end of the year and just seeing where I gravitate towards when it comes to books, because as I said, I find that interesting. So we're going to look at some numbers, and then I asked you to send me some questions about 2023 reading when it comes to favourite books, least favourite books, best new discovery, how many new authors I've read, best audiobooks, etc. So I'm going to answer those questions at the end of this video, and then next week's video will be my top books of the year. But before we get to that video, we need to kind of wrap up the year as a whole. First, let's do a whistle-stop tour of my November and December reading. I've mentioned quite a few of these books already on the channel, and I will link relevant reading vlogs in the description box down below. So to recap, I did a video where I read books by authors who I loved a long time ago and think I still probably will love, but haven't read a title of theirs in a while. So I just wanted to pick one up and see if I still connected with it as much as I had done, say, 10, 11 years ago. I read 4 in that video. I read Persuasion by Jane Austen, and I was unsure of this at the beginning, but then the more I read, the more I did come to enjoy it. I would say it's more complex than a lot of her other books. And I remember one of you commented and said that a lot of people reading this for the first time feel quite exhausted by the number of characters and everything that's going on. But by, I don't know, your umpteenth reread, you just want to defend Anne Elliot to the ends of the earth. And I can see that being true. Because Jane Austen's books become such an integral part of the literary landscape when we become intimately acquainted with them, I think it's quite difficult to remember what it was like the first time we ever read a particular novel of hers. For instance, Pride and Prejudice, which I have read several times and have seen the adaptations of many, many times. I think I probably was a bit frustrated with it the first time I read it, getting to grips with it. It's only when it becomes familiar and comforting that we can kind of relax a little bit. So I didn't have that relaxing, comforting experience with this book because it was the first time I was reading it. And I think that unanchored me a little bit. And then I had to have a word with myself and remember, I haven't read this book before. So yeah, I did end up enjoying this. I haven't actually watched an adaptation of it yet, but I would like to. I know that there are many. I don't plan to watch the most recent one, but I think there was one in the 90s and one in the early 2000s. So I'll watch one or maybe both of those. I read The Magic Toyshop by Angela Carter, and I think I've decided that maybe we are not for each other anymore, me and Angela. I enjoy her shorter work on the whole, but I do find that her characterization of people can be quite othering and alienating, even though on a sentence by sentence level, the prose is quite beautiful. So this one, I didn't end up enjoying as much as I had hoped to. However, I absolutely loved The Midwich Cuckoos by John Wyndham. And it wasn't a surprise, I guess, because I hoped I was going to love it, but I was, I guess, relieved. It's obviously been quite a long time since I picked up a book by him, which is why I was reading a book of his in that particular video. And I have a soft spot for old school sci-fi. I just think it's really fascinating to see what people, 50, 60, 70 years ago were writing about when it comes to technology. So yeah, this one I absolutely adored, and I may be speaking about it next week in my best books of the year, but I couldn't possibly say for certain. And then I read the short story collection Some Rain Must Fall by Michel Faber, And there were a couple of stories in here that I really loved. And if you want to hear more details on those in particular, you can head over to that reading vlog, which will be linked in the description box down below. I then filmed a reading vlog where I wanted to go to Foyles as a last trip to the bookshop before having a baby, but I wanted to read the books I bought at Foyles last time 18 months ago before going to buy more books. So I did that. Mostly. I tried to read Nettleblack by Nat Reeve, but the font is just so small that I've put it to one side for now, and I'll have to revisit it in a different form at some point in the future. But I did read More Fiya, which is edited by Kayo Chingonyi. This is a collection of Black British poetry and really, really loved it. And I read Beautiful Star by Yukio Mishima, which is again old school sci-fi. It's translated from the Japanese by Stephen Dodd, and it's about a family who believe that they are all from different planets. It reminded me quite a lot of Earthlings by Sayaka Murata, which I imagine was influenced by this book because this is a classic. It's really about anxiety post Second World War, which is what John Wyndham's book is about too, and using science fiction as a deflection or as an allegory to discuss that even further. This sense of impending doom, this sense of feeling lost and separated from humanity as a concept. So yeah, I really, really enjoyed this one. And then when I went to Foyles, I bought two books. One of them was Samanta Schweblin's latest short story collection, which I haven't read yet. But I did pick up this one too, which I have read, which is Bad Dolls by Rachel Harrison. This is a collection of 4 short stories. I didn't end up loving this as much as I'd hoped to. As I discussed in that reading vlog, I found a lot of these stories quite repetitive with very similar imagery, which felt a bit frustrating, especially in a book that's so short. I read 2 books to review for Toast magazine. I write for them every month, and at the moment I'm doing a series of articles which are reading and walking articles. So I'll go for a walk, I'll take a book with me, and then I'll write an article reviewing the book, talking about the walk with a map and photographs. In November, I read and reviewed Huma Qureshi's book Playing Games, which is a brilliant book about 2 sisters who are jealous of what the other one has but don't even want to admit that to themselves. One is trying to make it as a writer, one is a successful lawyer who is trying to start a family with her husband, and they really know how to press each other's buttons and get under each other's skin. The dialogue in this is so believable and biting. This book made me cry. I was just completely engrossed in it, would recommend it to so many people, and bought it for a couple of people for Christmas. In December, I read and reviewed Mistletoe Malice by Kathleen Farrell. This is a reissued classic. It had been out of print for 70 years. And then when Faber reissued Kay Dick's book, they, who was Kathleen's partner, her friend suggested to Faber, why don't you also reissue Kathleen's book too? This one in particular is brilliant. So Faber did. This is pitched as a Christmas family romp with a lot of explosive behavior, and I enjoyed this one quite a lot. I did think it was slightly repetitive. It is about a family coming together for Christmas in a cottage by the sea, and they really cannot stand each other. They go through this cycle where they'll try and spend time with each other in a room, then someone will say something, it will escalate, and then they'll all dissipate and they'll go out for a walk along the cliffs to cool down, regroup, come back hoping to restart, and it just happens all over again. All of the characters are quite detestable, but I did find it quite funny. So it wasn't one of my favourite books of the year, but I was very glad that I had read it, and I felt also, like with the John Wyndham book and like with Beautiful Star, this book was using the Second World War as fuel for the imagery that's going on in this book. The bickering, the infighting is a smaller version of wider societal unrest, I guess, across Europe. And I thought that that element worked particularly well. And whilst I didn't want to spend any time with these characters in real life, it was fun to spend a bit of time with them on the page. I uploaded a reading vlog on Christmas Eve. I think I called it Another Chaotic Reading Vlog because it was part book haul, there was a cooking segment, there was a reading vlog segment. I only read 1 book in that video, but it was this one which I very much enjoyed. This is Glass Town by Isabel Greenberg. This is a graphic novel about the Bronte siblings and the world of Glass Town that they created. and lost themselves in. I found it really endearing, actually, and I thought that the illustrations in here were beautiful. I will link that video in the description box down below if you want to go find out more about it. I then read 2 books for work, which I don't think I've spoken about, 2 adult books for work. Not adult, I just mean for grown-ups, because I also read lots of children's books during these months as well, which I won't talk about here, but as many of you know, I review books for a project called Inclusive Books for Children, and I read about 20 children's books in November and December to review for them, and I will link their website in the description box down below. But editorially, I worked on 2 books in November and December, and one of those was a poetry collection. This is Kaddy Benyon's Robbergirls, and as the tagline says, this is a sapphic retelling of the Snow Queen. So if you're looking for a poetry collection about seasons, nature, indigenous folk of the Arctic, and fairy tales, then I would recommend this. I will read you a quote from Helen Ivory on the back. She says, "Robbergirls takes us to the woods, to the snowlands, into the corners of the South where the oldest stories live. These poems both weep and they sing in their quest for wholeness and their honest longing to be kissed warm." I will link some sample poems in the description box if you want to go and have a read. As well as working on that editorially, I also worked on a book that's coming out in, I think it's June 2024. It's called Freakslaw by Jane Flett. This is set in the 90s and it is about a circus/freak show. And maybe I will talk about it more nearer to release date because you can't get your hands on it yet. So it seems a bit silly for me to chat about it right this second, but I did read that one because I was working on it. And then I read this, which is Strangers by Tachi Yamada. This is translated from the Japanese by Wayne P. Lammers. And I read this because it is the book version, the source material that the film All of Us Strangers is based on, which is coming out very shortly with Andrew Scott and Paul Mescal. And I was really intrigued by it because the blurb of both sounded quite different, and I thought it might be interesting to compare and contrast. I don't know when I'm going to get to see the film because I'll have to wait until it's streaming, but I look forward to watching it whenever that happens later this year. So Strangers is about a man who has recently divorced. He's feeling extremely lonely. He's staying in an apartment building where not many other people live. In fact, as far as he's aware, there's only one other woman who lives there. And then he starts talking to her one day. At the same time, he also encounters a man who he thinks looks very much like his father, but his parents died when he was about 12. So he thinks, well, it can't be my father, obviously. But then he starts talking to this man, and the man says, "Why don't you come back to my house for a drink?" So he goes back to this man's house for a drink, and the man's wife is his mother. And it's not just people who look like them, they are them. They are the ghosts of his parents. So he gets to talk to them as an adult, which he finds both haunting but cathartic. This book really strongly reminded me of Spring Garden by Tomoka Shibasaki, which is a book I read earlier this year, because this is also about a man who is recently divorced and lives in an apartment block where hardly anybody else lives apart from one woman who he starts talking to one evening and then becomes quite close to. Spring Garden is from 2014 and Strangers is from 1987, so I'm guessing that this one is actually quite heavily influenced by Strangers. In Spring Garden, the woman that the man starts talking to is really obsessed with this house that she used to have photos of, has always wanted to go into, and it's about them trying to get into this house and comparing the reality of that house with the photographs that she has. It's about the distance between memories and the actual events themselves. And there's just a lot of philosophical discussion. In Strangers, there's obviously a lot of very similar philosophical imagery to do with memory and how we may twist things in our brains to comfort ourselves, rewrite certain things. And it was the imagery in this book that I was drawn to the most, because our main character, as well as having a relationship with this woman that he's met and also talking to the ghosts of his parents, is a scriptwriter for TV series. And he's trying to create dialogue that will bring characters to life, and whilst he's doing that, he's working under the threat of one of his shows being cancelled, these characters never getting airtime and his story being lost. So I thought that that was very poetic. There is a bit of clumsy dialogue surrounding disfigurement in this that I wasn't a huge fan of, but on the whole, I very much enjoyed this book. And I know that in the film, it's been changed quite a bit. It's not set in Japan anymore. I believe that it's set in the UK, and it's also about a queer relationship as well. So yeah, I really look forward to seeing that later this year and then comparing it with this book. Then finally, before we get on to stats and also answering your questions about my reading year, I read a few picture books, which were just for me, not for work. In November, I read The Squirrel and the Lost Treasure by Coralie Bickford-Smith. I think that this, along with The Fox and the Star, are my favourite picture books by her. She does these most amazing picture books with the brightest colours about nature. She is a designer and illustrator. She designs the covers for most of the Penguin Classics series, so I'm sure that you're familiar with her work. And this is what the illustrations in here look like. I mean, come on, this red squirrel all curled up. So it's about a squirrel who likes to, as squirrels do, bury acorns, except this squirrel struggles to find them, as indeed lots of squirrels do, but then gets very excited when she realises that these lost acorns grow into trees, and actually she's helping the forest to survive by being forgetful. So yeah, this is just really, really cute and lovely, and I would like to hang prints of it on my wall. For Christmas, Jean, lovely Jean over at Jean's Bookish Thoughts, bought me as part of my Christmas present this picture book here, which is by David Greaves, called The Homesick Fox, and it's illustrated by Danielle Callahan. And this is about a fox who lives in the city but is homesick for the countryside and decides that he's going to try and find his way back there. It has a really lovely rhythm to it. True and bright, the moonlight shone, the homesick fox sped on and on, quickly through the wintry night, on the frost his footsteps light. And again, I can very clumsily hold this up. It has some really lovely illustrations inside too. And then I read two picture books about festivities. So I read Joy to the World, Christmas Around the Globe by Kate Palmer and Sophie Fatis. And this is about how people celebrate Christmas in different countries all around the world. So we have got Colombia, India, the Philippines, Canada, Mexico, Egypt, Ethiopia, Australia, Italy, Serbia, Argentina, Iceland and Lebanon. And I thought that this was a really lovely book, just looking at different traditions around the world. Then I also read Little Glow by Katie Sahota, illustrated by Harry Woodgate, which is about this little candle who is learning about how candles and lights in general feature in festivities in different cultures. So we're looking at Diwali, we're looking at Hanukkah, we are looking at Chinese New Year, Ramadan, etc. So this one was really lovely as well. So those are all the books that I read in November and December. So let us dive into my stats for 2023 as a whole. I have made notes. There will also be pie charts. Before I read these stats, a quick reminder that books are my job. This is in no way an aspirational number at all. In fact, I would have been very happy if I had read fewer books this year as well. A lot of these books are also children's books, but we'll get into the length of these books in a second. But yeah, I work in the publishing industry. I am a book reviewer. And as I said, I have been working this year with a project called Inclusive Books for Children, which made up a third of the number of books that I read. So in total in 2023, I read 301 books. And even though about 100 of those were for the Inclusive Books for Children project, I did read significantly more page number wise than I have done in previous years. So it was 301 books with a total of 53,061 pages. I will insert my end of year graphic that Storygraph create for every user here, so you can see every book that I read in 2023. If you're not on Storygraph, by the way, I very much recommend it. I made the move from Goodreads to Storygraph 2 or 3 years ago now, so I don't go on Goodreads at all these days. Storygraph is an independently owned business, and I think that they are great. You can also transfer your data very easily from Goodreads, which is a plus. But the data I have from Storygraph in my Storygraph Wrapped is for every book that I read in 2023, so all 301 of them. In the spreadsheet where I collect my own data, I decided to just record the data about the books that I personally had chosen to read. So about 200 of them, not the books I had been assigned for work, because I had no control over what those books were going to be, and I wanted to see what I was personally gravitating towards reading wise. But first off, Storygraph stats about every book I read. It says that my top moods were reflective, emotional, dark, and mysterious. I read 14% non-fiction, 86% fiction, 5% audio, and 95% print. And I think those stats are actually very similar to 2022. My most read authors were M.W. Craven. I think I read 5 of his books. He wrote the Washington Post series, which is still in progress. There's a new one coming out in 2023, a crime series. I read quite a few T.M. Logan books, again, another crime writer. I read a couple of Victor Short and Eva Balthasar books, and a couple of books by Claudia Pinheiro as well. The longest book that I read was Tomb of Sand by Gitanjali Sri, which is translated from the Hindi by Daisy Rockwell. That book was 740 pages long. And my shortest book, if we're including the children's books, would have been one of the board books that I read. But outside of that, I think it will have been one of the Strangers Press pamphlets. I read quite a few of those in 2023. They are an independent publisher based in Norwich, and they publish chapbooks of work in translation. I've spoken about them a lot before. I think they're great, and each of their pamphlets is about 50 or so pages long. So getting into the stats for the books that I chose to read that were not assigned to me for work, these are stats that I've pulled from the spreadsheet that I created. 28% of the books that I read in 2023 were translated. I read from 37 different countries, which I'm really pleased with, especially because it wasn't a goal that I had set for myself. It wasn't something that I was deliberately trying to do. It's just something that happened naturally. I read books that were mostly acquired in 2023, which I don't think is surprising given the job that I have, that I work in books and publishing. So 118 of the 200 or so books that I chose to read in 2023 were from 2023. 44 were from 2022, 17 from 2020, and then there was a kind of even split between the years around that, and then randomly a few books from 2009 as well. 67% of the books I read were published by small presses, and 47% of the books that I read were by writers of colour. And I think that those are all of the stats that I have to share with you. Let us dive into the questions that you sent me about my year of reading. The first question you asked me was, what was my favourite colour? My favourite cover out of the books that I read. And I went through that graphic from Storygraph where you could see all of the books that I read to remind myself. And actually, my 2 favourite covers were books that I didn't enjoy, which is quite funny. One of them would have been a cover by, I think, but I actually ended up reading it because it was on the International Booker Prize long list. I think it made the shortlist as well, and that is The Whale. This book is by Chung Myung-Kwan, and it's translated from the Korean by Kim Chi-young, and I just didn't get on with this book at all. And the other one that I think was a favourite cover of mine was a cover by, and that was Waiting for Ted by, let me remind myself of the author. It's by Marika Big, and this had quite a promising premise, but again, I just didn't think that the payoff was quite there. I will link my reviews of both of those books in the description box down below if you would like to go and listen to me talk about them further, but I don't know if you would want to do that because I didn't actually enjoy them. A book that you regret not getting to this year. I try not to feel too many regrets about these things because there are so many books and there is so little time. But I did have, I think, about 6 books that I didn't finish in 2023, which I was hoping to finish before the end of the year and didn't get round to. So I may do a reading vlog at some point where I do wrap up those books. But I don't feel too stressed about that either. I'm not bothered about it. But if I have to answer that question, I would probably choose those. Did you get into any sub-genres this year? I think the person who asked this question must listen to the Books Unbound podcast because they were talking about this in their wrap-up episode as well. So yeah, I read quite a few books about social media and idol culture. I read The Subtweet by Vivek Shraya. I read Idol Burning by Renasami. I read Y/N and Astral Season, BC Season, which were 2 books I actually didn't enjoy but fell into this category. And also We Had to Remove This Post by Hannah Barefoots, which I did enjoy, which is about content moderators on social media and the mental health impact of working in that industry. I really enjoyed reading around those subject areas in fiction form. Someone said, how has your reading ebbed and flowed throughout the year? Storygraph actually give you a chart which shows how many pages and books you read per month. So I will insert that on the screen at the moment. I think my most successful months, I'll put that in inverted commas, successful, if we're talking about books and page counts, were probably March and also June, because that's when I read the Women's Prize longlist and the Booker Prize longlist. And obviously there were some very large books in those piles. I definitely tapered off towards the end of the year, didn't read as much in November and December, but I think the rest of the year was pretty even, to be honest. In 2022, I didn't read anything in either May or September due to illness mostly, and I didn't have that this year, even though there were definitely periods where I was not feeling particularly well when I was recovering from operations, etc. But this year, I found reading more of a comfort when I was going through difficult things, whereas in 2022, I didn't feel like picking up a book if I was not in a great headspace, which is just completely fine. But it was interesting to notice that change this year, how books became once again more of a comfort, which is always nice to return to, I think. What was your favourite graphic novel? I think it was Garlic and the Witch by Bree Paulson, which is a middle grade novel, the second in a series. The first is Garlic and the Vampire. It's about a garlic bulb called Garlic, who is a particularly anxious person, and in Garlic and the Witch, she goes off on an adventure to a market to get some ingredients for the witch who tends the garden that she lives in. And it was just very wholesome and lovely and inclusive, and it was great. What was your favourite poetry collection? I think it was Unexpected Vanilla by Lee Yemi, which is translated from the Korean by Sojay. This is a book I read near the beginning of 2023, I think, and it contained lots of body imagery and folklore imagery, which, as you know, is my catnip. What book made you cry in a good way? I think I want to give a shout out to A Spell of Good Things by Ayobami Adebayo. This was a slow burn novel, much slower than her first book, which I really loved reading when it was shortlisted for the Women's Prize about 5-6 years ago. This one is definitely more of a character study, and the story comes together right at the end, and the final scene, I swear, destroyed me. I cried so much. It had such a powerful ending. And the reason I wanted to include questions like this in this video is because it's giving me the chance to talk about some books that I wouldn't get around to mentioning in my top favourites, because most of these are not my favorites. At least I've tried not to double up so that we're talking about different things this week and next week. But obviously there are so many amazing books that I read in 2023. I read over 300, so it's nice to give a shout out to as many of them as possible. The next question was, what was your most surprising book? Which can be good or bad. So I've picked some good ones and some bad ones. The good book was Miss Ice Sandwich by Miko Kawakami, and that was a good surprise because I'd read 2 of her books before and hadn't enjoyed them, but this one I absolutely loved, and I may be talking about it in next week's video. And the bad surprises were Chlorine by Jade Song, which was a disappointment because on the surface it sounded like a book I would really enjoy. It was about body horror and about mermaids and a coming of age story, but I just didn't really like the narration style. Night Shift, again, was a book that I thought that I would love because it was a queer story about obsession. I was hoping it was going to be like Notes on a Scandal, but I just found it a bit lackluster. And Sheep's Clothing by Celia Dale is a book I was really disappointed by because I loved the first book by her that I had read in 2022, which was called A Helping Hand. But this one just felt like a poor imitation of that book, and I found that really frustrating. The next question was, how many new to you authors did you read this year? Storygraph gave me this information. Apparently I read 252 new to me authors this year, which goes to show I don't tend to gravitate towards the same authors again and again, which is definitely something I didn't used to do. I would stick to authors that I knew and loved 10 years ago or whatever. If you looked at my bookcase back then, or bookcases, it would definitely be huge backlists of several authors as opposed to individual books by lots of individual authors. So I like that I read from lots of different places, from lots of different people these days. I find that quite exciting. Did you reread anything, and what were your favourites? I actually only reread one book in 2023, which was a surprise to me when I went back to double check that, but I guess makes sense because that's what happened. I only reread one, and that was for work, and it was The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson, because I was writing a paper for the British Library about Victorian literature and disfigurement, with an emphasis on Jekyll and Hyde, because I was also giving a talk with the British Library with other people, academics, about Jekyll and Hyde as well, and I will link the article that I wrote in the description box down below if you'd like to go read it. But I really enjoyed revisiting this book and then writing that article, doing that event. It was good fun. A book you thought could have been longer and one you thought could have been shorter. I picked Booker Prize books for this. A book that I thought could have been longer was Western Lane by Chetna Maru, which was a book about sisters and about the death of a mother. And I just would have liked to have spent more time with these characters. I would have liked it to have been stretched out a little bit more. The ending felt a bit abrupt. I always feel a bit greedy when I say things like that, but that's how I felt about that book. And two books I thought could have been perhaps a little bit shorter on the long list and short list were The Bee Sting by Paul Murray and In Ascension by Martin McInnes. I think in particular In Ascension could have been shorter. I read and reviewed all of the Booker Prize long listed books, and I'll link that vlog in the description box down below if you would like to go and check it out. What was your favourite book by a disabled / chronically ill author that you read in 2023? There are lots, but I will give a particular shout out to Head Above Water by Shahid Al-Shamari, which I read when it was longlisted for the Barbellion Prize at the beginning of 2023. The Barbellion Prize is on hiatus, so I won't be doing a reading vlog reading their long list this year because there is no long list, and that makes me really sad because I've discovered lots of great books through that prize, but fingers crossed it comes back in the future. What were some of your favourite publishers in 2023? As I mentioned, I read quite a lot from Strangers Press, which is the Norwich-based independent press that publishes work in translation, and I'll link them below. And as always, I really enjoyed looking at Tilted Axis and the books that they're publishing. They also publish work in translation too. What was the best book ending? Maybe My Husband by Maud Ventura. It had a little knife twist at the end, which I didn't particularly see coming. One of those endings that kind of changes your whole reading experience and makes you want to go back to the beginning. What did you learn about yourself as a reader this year? I think something that was cemented for me this year and will probably change in the future, but what worked for me in 2023 reading-wise was structured reading. Having themed reading vlogs to work towards, I just found really fun project-wise and kept my brain distracted when it needed to be distracted. I read the Women's Prize long list when I was recovering from surgery. I read the Booker Prize long list after a embryo transfer, and that was obviously a very, very anxious time, and that was a wonderful distraction. So in the past, I think setting TBRs for myself hasn't worked very much, and it's made me not want to read the books once I've picked the TBR, but that definitely wasn't the case in 2023. It really helped me, and also creating content for you brought me joy, and I hope brought you joy as well. I hope that it did, fingers crossed. What were your favourite audiobooks of 2023? The camera is flashing, so I'm going to whiz through these final questions. All the Little Bird Hearts by Victoria Lloyd Barlow was my favourite, I think, audiobook of the year, which was one of the Booker Prize long-listed books, and I really wish that it had been shortlisted. I also loved The Secret Diaries of Charles Ignatius Sancho by Patterson Joseph, who narrates the audiobook himself. Great historical fiction. And briefly A Delicious Life by Nell Stevens, which is about a teenage ghost who's haunting this monastery, and it's also a queer love story. Then, what is the book you most vividly associate with a period in 2023? Probably The Employees by Olga Rown, which very much reflected my IVF experience, even though it is a sci-fi novel and I'm not sure it was actually about IVF, but it was about humanity and what makes us human and what we want to take forward with us into the future. And I just found it very effective and moving in a way that maybe I wouldn't have found if I'd read it in an entirely different point in my life. What books are you hoping to find something similar to in 2024? So these two books didn't make it into my favourite books of the year lists, and those were Bandit Queens by Perini Schroff and Out by Natsuo Carino. Both of these are about groups of women who have been accused of or perhaps have murdered their husbands. Out was my favourite out of the two, but I hated the ending. And the Bandit Queens I very much enjoyed, but I didn't love it as much as the beginning part of Out because it didn't have that grittiness, I think. So I would love to find a book that I do love as a whole with those themes in 2024, so I'll be keeping my eye out for that. What is a book you wish more people would have on their radar? I Am Evidence by Courtney Conrad is a brilliant poetry collection. Hiding to Nothing by Anita Patti is also a brilliant poetry collection, which is about IVF, and I read it when it was longlisted for the Jaluk Prize in April, I think. And The Snow Collectors by Tracy May Hall, which is a weird experimental book that I would recommend for fans of Death in Her Hands by Atessa Moshfegh. It's about Arctic exploration, Gothic fiction, family, folklore, and the imagery surrounding snow is so beautiful. It wasn't one of my favourite books of the year because I didn't think it came together in the best way possible, but it had so many brilliant ideas. And finally, what were near misses when it comes to favourites, and I'm going to mention two here. And these are both books that I really loved when I was reading them, and they did actually make it into my favourite books of the year so far video in the summer, but they faded for me over time. I think they were very much of the moment. I think that they're brilliant books and I would definitely recommend them, but they just haven't had the staying power of the other books that I'll be talking about in my favourite books of the year video next week. And those were The Curfew by T.M. Logan, which is a crime/thriller, and Yellowface by Rebecca F. Kuang, which I absolutely inhaled. As I said, it's faded for me, and I think I can notice in both books actually some plot holes which I was more forgiving about at the time, but when it came to highlighting my favourite books of the year, I had to draw a line. I would love to know if you want to share your answers to these questions. I'll put the questions in the video description if you want to copy and paste them and then answer them in a comment down below. Thank you very much for joining me for this video. If you're new to my channel and you enjoyed it and you would like to subscribe, that would be lovely. And if you like my videos in general and you would like to consider supporting me on Patreon, that'd be very kind. Patreon is a place where you can tip creators whose work you enjoy, and the support that I receive over there allows me to keep creating free content for everybody on here and funds my time making these videos accessible by creating captions and all of that good stuff. I'm sending lots of love to you all, and I will see you next Sunday for my favourite books of the video. Yeah, bye.